The Winchester rifle shook in her hands. Its cold, heavy stock felt alien against her shoulder, a piece of this hard country she didn't belong to. Footsteps creaked on the wooden porch outside, slow and deliberate. Not one man, two, maybe three. Each sound was a hammer blow against the silence. Eliza pressed her back flat against the rough-hewn cabin wall, her breath catching in her throat. Behind her, hanging on a wooden peg, was Clara's wedding dress. It shimmered in the dim light, a ghost in white lace, a promise made and broken in this very room. A voice, slick with false confidence, slithered through the door. "We know you're in there, pretty lady." A low chuckle followed. They were enjoying this. They were predators, and she was trapped. For 10 years, this cabin had been a tomb. 10 years Ethan Cole had worked this unforgiving Wyoming range, a ghost himself, haunted by the memory of his dead wife. He was a man made of silent grief and barbed wire, faithful to a woman the snows had claimed a decade ago, until 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, she had appeared at his door. Clara's sister, a woman with eyes the color of autumn leaves and secrets that could burn this whole territory to the ground. Now those same eyes stared down the long barrel of a rifle, waiting for the man who'd sworn his heart was buried 6 feet under. The door splintered inward, and the world exploded in a shower of wood and violence. The year was 1887, and the Wyoming Territory was a place carved out by grit and gunpowder. It belonged to men who measured their worth in cattle and the endless miles of fence line they could string across the prairie. Ethan Cole was one of those men. 6 feet of weathered leather and unspoken sorrow, running 100 head on 40,000 acres of grass that kissed the horizon in every direction. His hands were a map of his life. Rope burns from stubborn calves, jagged scars from fighting with wire in the freezing cold. Calluses built from a man who'd built his entire world twice. The first time with hope, alongside a woman he loved. The second time with nothing but sheer, bone-deep stubbornness. Clara had been gone for 10 winters. He kept her world untouched, a perfect museum of a life cut short. Her blue dress still hung in the wardrobe, waiting for a Sunday that would never come. Her silver-backed hairbrush sat on the dresser, still tangled with a few strands of her golden hair. The bed they'd shared was a cold, empty expanse under quilts that still held the faint scent of lavender and a decade of regret. Other ranchers' wives, widows themselves, or just lonely, would bring him pies he never ate. Their daughters, bold and bright with life, would find excuses to ride past his property line, their laughter carrying on the wind. But Ethan Cole had loved once, and he had loved completely. And when that love was stolen from him in a February blizzard, something vital inside him had frozen solid too. The letters arrived like clockwork, once a month, all the way from Denver. Clara's family, the Bennetts, checking in on "Dear Ethan." They'd never approved of their high society daughter marrying a dirt-poor cowboy, but in death he'd become their responsibility. He burned every letter without opening it. They were ashes before the ink was even dry. All of them, until the one that arrived in late October, just as the first hints of winter began to bite. This one felt different. The handwriting was frantic, looping and sharp. He almost threw it into the stove with the others, but something made him pause. Something made him break the seal. The words inside were a gut punch. "Elizabeth is in trouble," her mother had written. "She's run from her engagement to Harold Peaton. You know the family, the banking fortune. She has been talking of nothing but finding the peace Clara wrote so fondly of in Wyoming. If she comes to you, Ethan, I beg you, please don't turn her away. She has nowhere else to go. Signed, Margaret Bennett." He'd crumpled that letter and tossed it into the flames, watching the words turn to black ash. He wanted no part of the Bennett's city-bred drama. Harold Peyton. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. A man who bought and sold lives like they were cattle futures. But the words from the letter refused to burn. They stayed with him, echoing in the vast silence of his life as the November snows began to fall, thick and heavy, promising a long, hard winter. He was out mending a fence line by lamplight the night she arrived, the wind a low moan across the plains. When he finally rode back toward the cabin, exhausted and cold to the bone, he saw it, a soft yellow glow in the windows, a light against the oppressive darkness. It was the first time his home had seen any light after sunset in 10 long years. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. He swung down from his horse, his hand instinctively going to the Colt on his hip. He crept to the door, pushing it open a silent inch. And there she was. She was sitting at Clara's kitchen table, bathed in the warm glow of the lantern, and she was reading Clara's diary. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, a silhouette against the cold night. The world tilted on its axis. It was like seeing a ghost, but worse, so much worse. She had the same golden hair, pulled back from a face with the same fine, delicate bones, the same slender hands that turned the page of the leather-bound book. She even had the same way of tilting her head as she read, a habit he'd once found so endearing. But where Clara had been calm, quiet water, this woman was a raging fire. She looked up, sensing his presence, and his breath hitched. Her eyes. They weren't Clara's sky blue. They were a deep, stormy brown, the color of wet earth and secrets, and they were staring right at him. "You're Elizabeth," he said. His voice was a raw, rusty thing from disuse. "Eliza," she corrected him, her voice clear and steady, though her hands trembled slightly where they rested on the diary. She closed the book with a soft thud. "I'm sorry for letting myself in. The door, it was unlocked." "Doors don't need locks out here," he managed to say, stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin was a shock. The smell of it was different too. Not just lavender and dust, but something else. Roses. Life. He was suddenly, painfully aware of the mud on his boots, the 3 days of stubble on his jaw, the faint smell of whiskey on his breath. "Your family's worried sick about you." A bitter, sharp laugh escaped her lips. It was a sound this cabin had never heard. "My family sold me to the highest bidder," she said, and her voice had an edge as sharp as a shard of glass. It was an edge Clara had never possessed. Harold Peaton offered them a controlling interest in a new silver mine, in exchange for a young, compliant wife. I decided I'd rather freeze to death on the Wyoming prairie than suffocate in a Denver ballroom. As if on cue, the wind picked up and fine, hard snow began to tap against the window panes. It was the kind of snow that meant business, the kind that could bury a man, a herd, a whole life in a matter of days. "Storm's coming in," Ethan said, his gaze shifting to the darkening world outside. "I know." She stood up, her eyes never leaving his. She was shorter than Clara, he noticed, more compact, like a tightly coiled spring. Clara wrote about the Wyoming winters in her diary. She said they could kill you if you weren't careful. She took a step closer, and the lamplight caught the fire in her eyes. "Or they could save you if you were brave enough to let them." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down Ethan's spine. What else had Clara written in that damn book? What secrets had his quiet, gentle wife told her sister about this place? About him? And why did looking at Eliza Bennett feel like he was drowning and breathing for the first time in a decade, all at once? She was utterly useless. That was his first thought, and his second, and his third. She couldn't cook to save her life. The eggs were burned to black crisps. The beans were so salty they were inedible, and she nearly set the whole cabin on fire just trying to figure out the drafts on Clara's old wood stove. "City girl," Ethan muttered under his breath, scrubbing a blackened pot with more force than necessary. He was angry. Angry at her for being here, for disrupting the careful, miserable order of his life. Angry at himself for the way his eyes kept following her around the small cabin. "I can learn." She was standing in the doorway to the small bedroom, her voice quiet but firm. She was wearing one of Clara's old aprons over her fine, dark traveling dress. The sight of that apron, tied around her small waist, made something tight and painful twist in his chest. Clara learned, didn't she? She wasn't born knowing how to do all this. Clara was different, he bit out, not looking at her. "How?" she pressed, refusing to let him retreat into his usual silence. How was she different? He couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words to explain that Clara had been like a gentle spring rain, nourishing and calm, while Eliza was like summer lightning, beautiful and dangerous and utterly unpredictable. He couldn't explain that Clara had seemed to fit into this harsh life as if she were born to it. her spirit as wide and open as the Wyoming sky. Eliza, on the other hand, fought everything. She fought the isolation. She fought the backbreaking work. She fought the endless, crushing silence that had been Ethan's only companion for 10 years. But damn her, she was stubborn. He'd give her that. She was a fighter. And that, more than anything, scared the hell out of him. The morning he found her in the barn at dawn changed something. He'd woken to a strange sound and found her out there, shivering in the cold, wrestling with his milking cow, her city-soft hands fumbling with the task. She was determined to prove him wrong, to prove she belonged. A wave of something he refused to name washed over him. It wasn't pity, it was something closer to admiration. "Like this," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. He moved behind her, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the frigid morning air. His big calloused hands covered her small trembling ones, guiding them. Gentle, but firm. You can't force it. She smelled of roses and cold air, and pure, unyielding determination. He could feel the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor running through her. As he guided her hands, she leaned back against his chest, just for a second, a tiny, involuntary movement of trust. And in that moment, Ethan Cole completely forgot how to breathe. The world narrowed to the feel of her back against his chest, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her skin through her thin dress. "There," she whispered, a sound of pure triumph as a stream of warm milk finally hit the bottom of the wooden bucket with a sharp ping. "I did it." "You did," he said, his voice thick. He dropped his hands and stepped away abruptly, putting a safe distance between them before he did something they would both live to regret. But it was too late. Something had already been done. A line had been crossed. And as he watched her carry the bucket back to the house, her walk proud and steady, he knew his carefully constructed world of grief was beginning to crack. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to shore up the walls or let them crumble completely. The blizzard hit 3 days later, and it hit with the fury of a vengeful god. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a high, thin sound like souls being torn from their bodies. The snow wasn't just falling, it was a solid, blinding wall of white that completely erased the world beyond the cabin walls. Ethan rode out in the teeth of it, a grim line set in his jaw. When he returned hours later, half frozen and caked in ice, the news was bad. Half his herd was gone, scattered to God knew where in the white hell that had descended upon them. He could lose everything, everything he'd spent the last 10 years rebuilding from ashes. "I'm going after them," he told Eliza, his voice raw from the wind. He was pulling on his heaviest coat, checking the loads in his rifle. It was a suicide mission, and they both knew it. "In this? You'll die out there, Ethan," she said, her eyes wide with a fear that was entirely for him. "They're all I have left," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It wasn't just about the cattle. It was about the work. The work was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. But as he reached for the door, he saw she was already moving. She was reaching for Clara's old winter coat, a heavy thing of wool and fur that had been hanging on its peg for a decade. She pulled it on, her chin set in that stubborn line he was beginning to know all too well. "Then I'm coming with you." "Like hell you are," he snarled, turning on her. "This ain't some Denver sleigh ride. This is real." "I know what it is," she shot back, her brown eyes flashing. "You need help, an extra set of eyes. And I need to prove that I belong here, that I'm not just some useless city girl who's going to break." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "I need to prove I'm not Clara. I'm something more." Her belonging here was tangled up with his grief, with the ghost of her sister. And heading out into that storm together felt like a dangerous, irreversible step into a future neither of them could predict. What would it cost them both to find out if she truly belonged? And what would they find out there in the blinding snow besides the cattle? They found what was left of the herd huddled in a steep draw 2 miles south of the cabin. They were half frozen, miserable, but alive. The work of driving them back was brutal, a nightmare of biting wind and deepening snow. They fought for every inch, two small figures pushing against the full, raw power of nature. By the time they stumbled back into the barn, night had fallen. and the storm was still raging. Eliza's lips were tinged with blue, and her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't unbutton her coat. Ethan's own fingers were numb, his face a mask of ice. He worked quickly, settling the cattle before half carrying her into the warmth of the cabin. He built the fire up until it roared in the hearth, chasing the deadly chill from the room. He made coffee, black and strong, and laced it heavily with the whiskey he kept for emergencies. This qualified. She sat wrapped in a pile of Clara's quilts by the fire, still trembling, clutching the hot mug in her hands. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the shriek of the wind outside. They had faced death together, and it had changed the very air they breathed. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet. He was standing by the mantel, staring into the flames, unable to look at her. "For what?" she asked, her voice raspy. "For not giving up. For being here." He risked a glance at her. She was looking at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and for the first time, he didn't see Clara's ghost. He didn't see the fine lady from Denver. He saw Elizabeth Bennet, brave and stubborn and achingly, astonishingly beautiful in her own right, with her hair coming loose from its pins and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was real, and she was here. "Is this what Clara felt?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This feeling, like you've earned your place in the world. This belonging." The question was a knife in his gut. Clara never had to fight for it, he said, the words rough. It came to her as easy as breathing. "Maybe that's the difference," Eliza said, her gaze intense, searching his. "Maybe that's why I need to stay, to fight for something. Maybe the things you have to fight for are the only things worth having." The words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning, charged with the energy of the storm both outside and inside the cabin. Ethan stood up abruptly, the movement jerky and unnatural. He retreated to the safety of distance, turning his back to her and adding another log to the fire he didn't need. He needed to be alone, to think. But that night, lying in his cold, empty bed, he found himself listening for the sound of her soft breathing in the next room. Found himself wondering, for the first time in 10 years, what it would feel like to not be alone anymore. Later, much later, he heard it. A soft, muffled sound, choked back, almost silent. She was crying in the dark, trying so hard not to be heard. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to go to her, to comfort her, to hold her. It took every last ounce of his willpower to stay in his own bed, his knuckles white as he gripped the blankets. Some battles, he told himself, his heart aching with a pain that was new and terrifyingly familiar, were meant to be fought alone. But as he lay there, listening to her silent tears, he had to wonder if he was lying to himself. The strangers came on a Tuesday. The blizzard had broken, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white under a painfully bright sun. Ethan had ridden into town for supplies, a trip he'd put off for too long. The silence in the cabin after he left was deafening. Eliza felt his absence like a physical weight. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she saw them, two dark figures on horseback cresting the ridge to the east. They weren't cowboys. They didn't move like ranchers checking a fence line. They moved with the slow, easy confidence of wolves closing in on a fold. She'd seen their type before, in the smoky back rooms of Denver's less reputable establishments. Men her fiancé Harold Peaton sometimes did business with. Men who took what they wanted and damned the consequences. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. Her first thought was of Clara's diary. She remembered a specific passage, one she'd skimmed over before. "Drifters sometimes pass through," Clara had written. "Ethan says they prey on the isolated ranches, knowing the law is ours, sometimes days away. He keeps the Winchester loaded, just in case." The Winchester. Her eyes flew to the fireplace mantel, where the long rifle rested on two wooden pegs. She dried her hands on her apron, her heart starting to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy rifle down. It smelled of gun oil and cold steel. Following a half-remembered motion of Ethan's, she worked the lever action, checking the chamber. 5 bullets. Dear God, only 5. She had never fired a gun in her entire life. Hello, the house? The taller of the two men called out as they reined in their horses a few yards from the porch. His voice was oily, carrying a false cheerfulness that made the hair on her arms stand up. Just looking for a little water for our horses, ma'am. Been a long ride. Eliza stayed silent, hidden behind the curtain, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. She prayed they would just move on, assume no one was home, but they didn't. She heard the creak of saddle leather, the thud of boots hitting the ground. The front door didn't just open, it exploded inward, ripped from its hinges with a single violent kick that sent splinters flying across the room. The tall man stepped through the shattered doorway, a cruel smirk on his face. He actually tipped his hat like a gentleman caller arriving for tea. Now that's more like it, he drawled, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on her. They moved over her body like dirty hands, stripping her bare. Well, look what we have here. A pretty little thing, all alone out in the big bad world. He took a step inside, his spurs jingling ominously on the wooden floor. Where's your man, sweetheart? Gone, she managed, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. The weight of the rifle was the only thing keeping her knees from buckling. He won't be back for hours. Perfect, the man grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. The second man appeared behind him, a shadow in the doorway. He was shorter but thicker, meaner looking. A jagged, ugly scar ran from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth, pulling his lips into a permanent, gruesome sneer. That gives us plenty of time to get acquainted. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands, the barrel trembling. Stay back, she warned, her voice a thin thread of sound. The tall one laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that filled the small cabin. Or what? You gonna shoot us, little bird? I'll bet you don't even know how to use that thing. He took another step forward, confident, arrogant. She didn't think. She just reacted. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder the way she'd seen Ethan do it a dozen times, squinted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, the recoil slamming the butt of the rifle painfully into her shoulder. The bullet splintered the new door frame, inches from the man's head. Both men froze, their smirks vanishing, replaced by looks of stunned disbelief. The next one goes in your chest, Eliza said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't feel. She worked the lever action, the metallic shuck-shuck sound echoing in the sudden silence. The spent cartridge ejected, landing with a clatter on the floor. Your choice. For a long, tense moment, she thought they might actually leave. The tall one's eyes were calculating, measuring the distance between them, the odds, the tremor she couldn't hide in her hands. Then slowly, a new, even uglier smile spread across his face. You got 4 shots left, little bird, he said, his voice a low growl. And there's 2 of us. You think you can get us both before we get to you? They separated then, fanning out, moving to flank her. It was a practiced, predatory maneuver. Eliza backed away, her feet stumbling, until she was pressed against the hard edge of the kitchen table. She swung the long barrel of the rifle back and forth between them, her heart hammering. Easy now, the scarred one crooned, his voice a horrifyingly gentle rasp. Nobody needs to get hurt. We just want to be friendly. Real friendly, the tall one agreed, his hand slowly, deliberately, moving toward the pistol holstered on his hip. He was testing her, daring her. Eliza fired again. This time her aim was truer. The bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain and surprise. He slammed into the wall and slid to the floor, cursing, clutching his bleeding arm. 3 shots left. But the victory was short-lived. The scarred man didn't hesitate. He drew his own pistol with lightning speed, the barrel of black, unblinking eyes staring right at her. Now you've done it, he snarled, his scarred lip twisting. You shot my brother, Billy. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline making her vision swim. The scarred man took a step forward, raising his gun, his aim steady and sure. And in that moment of crystal, terrifying clarity, Eliza knew she was about to die. Then the cabin door, or what was left of it, slammed open so hard it ripped the remaining hinge from the frame. Ethan Cole stood there, framed against the bright snow, a figure of pure, cold fury. His Colt was already in his hand, looking like a natural extension of his arm. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, took in the entire scene in 1/17th of a second. Eliza, white-faced and trembling against the table. The wounded man, Billy, groaning on the floor. And the scarred stranger, his gun trained directly on Eliza's heart. Drop it. 2 words. Not a request. A command. They were flat, final, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. The scarred man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking from Eliza to Ethan. It was the last mistake he'd ever make. Ethan's gun boomed, the sound of physical blow. The scarred man's pistol flew from his grasp, his ring and pinky finger simply ceasing to exist in a spray of red. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed to his knees, clutching his mangled hand. Both of you, Ethan said, his voice still dangerously calm as he walked into the room, his own gun never wavering. Out, now, before I forget my Christian manners. The wounded man, Billy, scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pain and terror. He half dragged, half carried his screaming brother out the door and into the snow. And if I ever see either of you on my land again, Ethan called after them, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, I'll bury what's left. The sound of frantic, clumsy hoofbeats faded into the vast Wyoming silence. The danger was over, but inside the cabin the violence still hung in the air, thick as gun smoke. Eliza stood frozen, the heavy Winchester still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. Her body hadn't gotten the message that she was safe yet. It was still braced for death. Eliza. Ethan's voice was different now, gentle. He moved toward her slowly, cautiously, the way a man approaches a spooked horse. You're safe now. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and she saw past the cold fury to the raw, naked fear he was trying so desperately to hide. It was fear for her, fear of what might have happened, fear of being too late. I thought, she started, but the words wouldn't come. Her legs, which had held her up through sheer terror, finally gave out. She started to fall. Ethan crossed the room in 2 long strides and caught her before she hit the floor, gathering her up against his chest. She buried her face in his rough wool coat, the smell of him, pine and leather and cold winter air, filling her senses. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart hammering as fast as her own. You did good, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his lips brushing against her hair. Clara's rifle in the hands of a Bennett woman. Those bastards never stood a chance. She tilted her face up to look at him, her hands still clutching his shirt. They were so close. Close enough for her to count the fine lines etched around his storm gray eyes, to see the flecks of silver in his dark hair at the temples. Close enough that when his gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, something hot and electric, something as powerful as the blizzard they'd survived, passed between them. This was it, the point of no return. A moment suspended in time where the past and the future collided, and they both knew it. Ethan! His name was a broken whisper on her lips, and it shattered something deep inside him. 10 years of loneliness. 10 years of faithful, unwavering grief. 10 years of telling himself that love was a door that had closed for him forever. But Eliza Bennett was here. She was alive and warm and trembling in his arms. And she was looking at him, not like he was a broken man, but like he was salvation. He kissed her. It wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability, like a river finding its way to the sea. It started gently, a tentative brush of lips, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. Then it deepened, becoming something hungrier, something desperate. 10 years of dammed-up want and sorrow and loneliness compressed into a single, breathtaking moment of surrender. She tasted of coffee and gunpowder and a courage that humbled him. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Ethan Cole forgot everything. He forgot the cold cabin, the broken door, the blood on the floor. He forgot the 10 years of empty nights and silent dawns. He forgot the ghost that lived between them. All he knew was the impossible, undeniable sweetness of not being alone. He backed her against the kitchen table, his mouth moving from hers to the soft, graceful curve of her neck. She gasped his name. her head falling back, and the sound ripped through him like whiskey and lightning. Eliza! His hands, rough and calloused, found the small buttons at the back of her dress. They were clumsy, shaking, but she didn't stop him. If anything, she arched against him, her own fingers working frantically at the buckle of his belt. This was madness. This was a betrayal of everything he held sacred. And it was the most right, the most honest thing he had felt in a decade. Her dress slipped from her shoulders, pooling at her waist, revealing skin that was as pale and perfect as cream in the dim afternoon light. She stood before him in her chemise and petticoats, beautiful and brave and wanting him with a ferocity that matched his own. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for her, to finally touch her, to erase the years of cold. And then he stopped. His eyes had lifted, drawn by some unseen force. And there on the mantel, watching them, was the photograph. Clara, his wife, his first and only love, captured forever with a gentle, painted smile. The woman who had died in this very room, her hand growing cold in his as he promised her soul that he would love her, and only her, forever. The guilt hit him not like a wave, but like a physical blow, like a fist to the gut. It knocked the air from his lungs, the warmth from his blood. I can't. The words were torn from him, a raw, ragged sound. He staggered back, away from Eliza, his breath coming in harsh, painful gasps. God help me, Eliza. I can't do this. Eliza's face, which had been soft and open with passion, crumpled. All the light went out of her eyes, leaving them dull with pain and humiliation. Ethan, this is Clara's house, he choked out, gesturing wildly around the room. This is Clara's room. Her. He couldn't say the word, couldn't say husband, because it would shatter them both into a million pieces. She pulled the top of her dress back up with shaking hands, her movements stiff and jerky. She wouldn't look at him. I understand, she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of itself. Do you? He asked, his own voice cracking. No, she said, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. But I should have known. I should have realized from the beginning that I could never, ever compete with a ghost. She walked past him, her spine held ramrod straight despite the tears now streaming down her face, and went into the small bedroom. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click that sounded to Ethan like the end of the world. He stood alone in the wreckage of his kitchen, in the wreckage of his carefully controlled life. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like a restless spirit. Inside, the silence stretched taut like a fresh wound. On the mantel, Clara's photograph smiled its serene, eternal smile. He had made a promise. But what happens when forever is suddenly faced with the impossible present? What happens when a dead woman's memory stands directly in the path of two living, breathing, broken hearts? By morning, she was gone. The note was on the kitchen table, tucked under the salt shaker. 3 short lines in her elegant, careful handwriting. Thank you for showing me what Clara found here. I'm sorry I couldn't be her. The train leaves Cheyenne at noon. E. Ethan read it once, then twice, standing in the cold, empty kitchen. The coffee she must have made before leaving was cold in the pot. The fire in the hearth had died down to gray, lifeless ashes. The entire cabin felt wrong. The air itself felt thinner, emptier without her in it. He should let her go. This was the right thing, the honorable thing. He should count himself lucky that the temptation was removing itself before he damned them both to hell. It was for the best. Instead, he found himself running to the barn, his heart pounding a desperate, frantic rhythm. He threw a saddle on his fastest horse, his hands moving with a fumbling urgency. This was insane. The road to Cheyenne was 37 miles of wind-scoured frozen prairie. He'd never make it. He pushed the horse hard, harder than he ever had before, its powerful hooves devouring the frozen, unforgiving ground. The wind tore at him, stinging his eyes, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was the gaping, raw hole her absence had left in his life. He saw the note again in his mind. I'm sorry I couldn't be her. The words were a knife twisting in his gut. He had done that. He had made her feel like a replacement, a pale imitation of her sister. The train whistle echoed across the frozen flats, a long, mournful cry. It was distant, But it was there. He was too far, too late. The thought screamed in his mind, but he didn't slow down. He rode on, spurred by a desperate, illogical hope. He rode because some chances only come once in a lifetime, and he had already let one slip through his fingers 10 years ago. He rode because a decade of faithful, lonely grief had taught him the crushing, unbearable weight of words left unsaid. He rode because Elizabeth Bennet was not her sister, and she deserved to be loved for the fierce, stubborn, brave woman she was, not in the shadow of a ghost. The depot finally appeared through the hazy morning light, a small cluster of buildings huddled beside the twin steel rails that sliced the territory in two, connecting this empty land to everywhere else. The eastbound train was there, sitting on the tracks, breathing out great white plumes of steam like a slumbering iron dragon. Passengers were climbing aboard, heading for Denver, for Chicago, for New York, heading back to the world Eliza had run from. He saw her immediately, a small, solitary figure in a dark traveling coat, standing on the platform, clutching a small carpet bag like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. She was staring at the train with the expression of a person about to jump off a cliff. Ethan swung down from his horse before it had even fully stopped, his boots thudding loudly on the hard-packed dirt. He walked toward her, each step echoing on the wooden platform. She turned at the sound, her head snapping around. Her face was a kaleidoscope of a dozen different emotions at once. Hope warred with fear, which battled with resignation, which gave way to something that looked so much like love it stole his breath. "You came," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The train whistle blew again, a sharp, piercing shriek. "All aboard! Last call for the eastbound express." He was close enough now to see the tear tracks on her cold, flushed cheeks, to see the battle she was fighting to keep more from falling. He was close enough to reach out and touch her, to pull her into his arms and never let go. And God help him, he wanted to. A conductor in a blue uniform walked the length of the platform, his voice a booming litany of destinations. Denver, Grand Junction, all points east. It was the world of banks and arranged marriages and lives lived according to other people's rules. The world where she was supposed to marry Harold Peaton. The train whistle screamed one last final time. Steam hissed. The massive iron wheels began to grind, to turn, to slowly pull the train away from the station. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. "Come home, Eliza." Her eyes flicked from the moving train to his outstretched, calloused hand, then up to his face. In his eyes, she saw not the grief-stricken widower, but a man offering a future. A hard future, maybe. A life of wind and work and endless skies. But a life that was theirs. She took his hand, her small fingers intertwined with his. A perfect fit. Together they stood on the empty platform, watching the train pull away, carrying other people toward other lives, until it was just a small black speck disappearing into the vastness of the horizon. A smile touched her lips. It wasn't Clara's gentle, serene smile. It was Eliza's, fierce and bright, and full of a hard-won joy. "It's funny," she said, her voice clear and strong against the wind. "It took me all this time to realize I was never running from anything in Denver. I was running toward this." They walked back to where his horse waited patiently, two small figures etched against the endless, unforgiving, beautiful landscape. Above them, the Wyoming sky stretched out, blue and infinite, full of storms and sunlight and possibility. Behind them, the sound of the train whistle faded completely, becoming nothing more than a distant memory. If this story of a love found in the heart of the unforgiving West touched your heart, do me a favor and hit that like button, and drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I truly love hearing from you all. For more tales from the American frontier, where love and loss walked hand in hand under an endless sky, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Until next time, keep your hearts open and never be afraid of a second chance.